people assume that ninth grade students who are failing most of their classes have GPAs as low as 0, living in concentrated poverty beset with drugs and violence, are simply a lost cause. That if you haven't reached a child by the age of 5, it is too late. Well, as a neuroscientist, and after spending the last decade of my life getting to know the young people in Baltimore City, I can tell you that that is simply not true. THREAD's model is unprecedented. We enroll the most academically underperforming high school students in Baltimore City. To give you a sense of what this means, at Douglas High School, the school at the epicenter of the unrest in Baltimore last year, the average GPA of our first cohort of students was 0.15, not 1.5, 0.15 on a 4.0 scale. Our students are exemplary human beings that are in extraordinary circumstances. The challenges they face outside of school range from homelessness to having a parent who's deceased or incarcerated. Once in THREAD, they stay with us for a decade, longer than your average American marriage. So it's the rest of high school and 6 years after. We lovingly joke it's like a gang or a sorority, however you want to look at it. Once they're in, they can't get out. Once you're family, you're always family. When enrolled, each student is given a group of volunteers, up to 5 volunteers for each student, who do everything from pack their lunches, give them rides to school, provide tutoring. If you can imagine doing it for your own child or your niece or your nephew, we do it for ours. And it is our unique volunteer structure that allows us to make this enduring 10-year commitment to all of our students. So now I'm going to tell you a story about the most transformative relationship I have had with a young man named Maurice. And then I'm going to tell you how that relationship is not unique. It is actually one of hundreds of relationships in THREAD that are not only allowing our students to beat the odds, but are fundamentally changing the odds for all students in Baltimore City. Maurice grew up in West Baltimore, and his mother, a heroin addict, reached a point where when he was 13 years old, she could no longer take care of him. She literally had to abandon him on a street corner. Having to figure out where to find food, where to stay, how to meet his most basic human needs, Maurice fell into a life on the streets. By the time we met during his freshman year, he was not only in danger of dropping out or failing out, he was in danger of ending up dead or in jail. So we started with the basics. I would drive to his house and provide a ride to school. He would play basketball with my husband at our house on the weekends. And when he sometimes didn't have a place to stay, he would stay with us. We even went on a camping trip in the middle of January where there was 8 inches of snow on the ground. I was much less experienced back then to take a bunch of teenagers camping in January. But our biggest argument between Maurice and I was whether or not he could bring his gun. So many, many rides to school, many basketball games, and many overnights later, we formed a relationship of deep trust. It was difficult, it took a long time, and it wasn't easy, but eventually we found our common bonds. As a result, Maurice not only graduated from high school, but this past spring, he received his college degree from Coppin State University. And that's not all. He most recently joined THREAD's board of directors, where he is now officially my boss. And that's not all. It turns out that the camping trips became a formative part of Maurice's life. So even once he was an alumni, he continued coming on the trips. And it was on one of the camping trips where he met a young man named Malcolm and offered to start driving Malcolm to school. Over time, Malcolm began to change the address that he was asking Maurice to pick him up at. And having been homeless, Maurice understood exactly what that meant. So what did he do? He asked Malcolm to move in with him. So fast forward, it's now April 2015, and I'm sitting in back-to-back meetings. I walk out, and I looked out at my phone, and it is blown up with text messages. It says, "Get to Douglas now. It's about to go down. Hurry up." There were other words in there, too, which I won't share. Before I could even text Maurice back, I get this picture, and it's him. It's a selfie of Malcolm and Maurice driving away from Douglas High School. So while other young people were facing off with police, what had Maurice done? He had gone and gotten Malcolm, and he had mobilized hundreds of THREAD staff and volunteers to go and locate all 200 of our students. It took until 2 in the morning, but thanks to Maurice's leadership, we located all of our students and were able to ensure not just their physical well-being, but their emotional well-being. So when you think about Maurice, is he a lost cause? Or is he the pipeline of leadership for our city? Is he our future? And you have to ask yourself, what are the barriers that would hold someone like Maurice, as talented and as special as he and every other young person in Thread is, back? I like to boil it down to the most basic of decisions. We know statistically that students that go to school graduate. So let's just take that as a very simple example, and let's walk through how the brain makes that most basic decision. Am I going to go to school today, or am I going to do something else? Maybe the something else is to stay home and watch your younger siblings so that your parent can go to work and provide for your family. Maybe the something else is for you to actually go and work instead of go to school to provide for your family. Maybe the something else is to stand on a street corner because it's what you know and provide for your family. So how do we influence the decision making if we want a young person to go to school? Well, this is a huge oversimplification, but we're going to start with two things that drive the decision making of all of us, not just Maurice. Turns out we're very much alike. The first is reward. So let's imagine that you can sell drugs today and earn $200 standing on a corner. If you go to high school, graduate, get into college, graduate, get a middle-class job, maybe you can earn $400 a day. Which is more? Well, even though 400 is technically more than 200, the problem is you don't get the 400 until many years in the future. So our brain discounts the value of that $400 over time. So actually, the $200 that you're going to get today is more valuable. So in the decision-making process, we're already losing when it comes to reward. The second thing that your brain looks at is likelihood. So it's basically a sniff test. How much do I believe if I perform that action, I'm actually going to get the reward? So if I sell drugs, do I believe I'm going to get $200? What our brains all do is we go back through like a movie reel in our head and we look at the data points that we have. So how many people have you known that have sold drugs and gotten $200? How many people have you known that have gone to high school, graduated, gone to college, graduated, and gotten a middle-class job? If you have a ton of data points that tell you it's going to happen, you're going to get your $200 if you sell drugs, why would you ever delay gratification for something that's not going to come? So you have to ask yourself, is Maurice a lost cause? No. Maurice and all of our young people are working with the data that they have. So in Thread, what we work to do is we work to change the reward. We work to change the likelihood. How do we do that? Once students are enrolled, like I said, they have a Thread family. This is up to 5 volunteers who do anything you would do for your own child, and they do it over the course of a decade. What does that mean in terms of reward? Well, when you show up to take someone to school, you can provide a real-time reward. Maybe it's as simple as bringing breakfast. It's a lot easier to go to school if you are not hungry, if you have clean clothes, and if you've had a place to sleep. Sometimes the reward could be as simple as just looking someone in the eyes and saying, I know it was really hard for you to get up this morning given everything that happened in your house last night, but I see you and you matter, and I appreciate that you got in this car. We also work to influence the likelihood function. So when you think about the Thread family, they're supported by what we call Thread resource teams. There's legal, health, housing, workforce development, academics, college and career preparation, community service. These are teams that are also volunteers who are experts. So if a young person's being evicted, instead of the Thread family or their parents trying to figure out how to prevent an eviction, they just call the Thread legal resource team, and they help provide them a pro bono attorney who will prevent that eviction. Why does that matter? Well, one, it's good to have a place to stay. But two, what happens? Well, all of a sudden we're in a room and now you've got an attorney, a young person, their family, and a bunch of volunteers. Now, think about the data points. That young person just met someone who went to college, graduated, got a middle class or better than middle class job. So by striving together, by having a common goal, the common goal could be to prevent an eviction, you actually form a deep and meaningful relationship and you influence the likelihood function of everyone involved. What does this amount to? Well, in the last 12 years in Thread, it has amounted to us never losing a single student. We have retained 100% of our students. It is messy. At some point, every single student in Thread will tell you, I'm not in thread, I've dropped out. But we just keep showing up and showing up and showing up and building that trust over time. And eventually things change. And what does that amount to? Well, that amounts to 92% of our students have graduated from high school within 5 years of joining thread. These are students who come in, who people have viewed as a lost cause, in some cases disposable. 92% of them graduate from high school. So you have to ask yourself, the data is super, super clear. We know that for a child to grow into a happy, healthy adult, what do they need? They need just one consistent, caring adult in their life. So as a scientist, I like to run the math. We have approximately 80,000 students in the Baltimore City public school system, and we have around 400,000 to 500,000 adults. In theory, we should have extra. Where is everybody? What's going on? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. The adults are working with the same data set that the young people are. Why would you take time away from your family, your job, your spiritual life to go drive a kid to school if they're going to end up dead or in jail anyway? You wouldn't. But if you knew that driving that student to school, that showing up even when they didn't want to see you, could actually save their life and yours, you would. So what has happened is Maurice is not only providing a data point for our younger students, he's providing a data point for all of Baltimore City to say that this is possible, it is happening. There is not a single child who is a lost cause in our city. What has that amounted to? It has amounted to, thread has grown to this year we will serve over 300 students and their families with the support of over 1,000 volunteers and collaborators, and it's just the beginning. So what's next for thread? We have worked to set out a plan where we will eventually reach 5% of every freshman class in the Baltimore City public school system, the most academically underperforming 5%. That would mean reaching 3,000 students. And in order to do so, we would have to weave together relationships between 3,000 students, 7,000 volunteers, the adult counterparts of our volunteers, students, collaborators, donors, board members, staff. All in, it would be about 20,000 adults. 20,000 adults, well, that's not only 5% of every freshman class in the school district, that's 5% of the adults in the city. That's a movement. And we think about in thread, what was originally intended in the civil rights movement? It was to bring about a diverse and inclusive and equitable society. How do you do that? Well, we bring Baltimore together every day in thread through deep and meaningful relationships. Why should you care? Well, you should care because it turns out that healthy relationships matter for all of us. A study that came out of Harvard that began in 1938 looked at 724 men and followed them into their 80s and 90s and asked a single question: what is the number one thing that drives whether or not these men were happy and healthy into late adulthood? It wasn't their race, it wasn't their job, it wasn't their educational attainment, it was the relationships they had. And it wasn't the quantity, so it wasn't how many friends did they have on Facebook or how many tweets or how many likes. It was the quality of relationships. What mattered was, did they have a core group of people that when things got really tough, they knew had their back? The men who had a group that had their back had less cancer, less heart disease, less dementia. It fundamentally changed their physical and mental and emotional well-being. And it turns out that relationships are not just important for individual health, they're important for our collective health. Another study that came out of Harvard looked at two towns, Youngstown and Allentown. Demographically, they looked quite similar. They had similar racial breakdown, class breakdown, religious preference. But after they lost their main industries, what they found is that the outcomes in those towns were quite different. Allentown was faring far better in terms of education, crime, the economy. And so they wanted to understand why, what was driving that difference. And it turned out it was something simple. Again, in Youngstown, the town that wasn't doing well, we might go to church together, we'd also work at the factory together, and we'd go bowling together. But in Allentown, the town that was doing well, we might go to church together, we would bowl together, and we would work at the factory together. It was the diversity in the cross connections that actually led to a healthier city. So when you think about why has this not been done? Why has this not been done in every city? The answer to that question, too, is simple. It's because relationships are really hard. They're not a quick fix. They're messy. They take time. You have to pay attention to them, and they don't always feel great. So how do we do this in Thread? It's practicing change. We have found that the key to our young people maturing into resilient, self-motivated, and responsible citizens is that the adults have to model that change. It's not just about, success is not just defined as your students succeeding, it's as your own growth. If we want our students to go to school and be responsible, then when we say we're going to take them to school, we have to show up and take them to school and be responsible ourselves. If we want our students to not give up on themselves, we have to not give up on them. And when we show up, it's not just about showing up, it's how we show up. Are we vulnerable? Do we actually share our challenges and our burdens with them? Do we show up ready to help, or do we show up ready to be helped? You know, when Maurice and I would take our rides to school, we rarely talked about academics. Mostly we would argue over what to listen to on the radio station, although over the years we finally figured out that we both love Motown favorites. We would talk about everything from his complicated relationship with his mom and my super complicated relationship with my sister. When his brother died suddenly, we just sat there. We didn't talk at all. And when I finally hit a breaking point, overwhelmed by the fact that I couldn't have a child, and I felt like I could talk to absolutely no one, Maurice listened. Years later, when I collapsed, turns out that I had an ectopic pregnancy, was bleeding internally, an emergency surgery, 4 blood transfusions, and chemotherapy later, I awoke. I awoke to Maurice. I awoke to my husband. I awoke to all the students, volunteers, collaborators, my family and friends in Thread who brought me back to life. And when, a few years later, I welcomed my daughter, Evie Grace, into this world, they celebrated with me. So we have to remember it is not just children living in poverty that need these deep interpersonal bonds. We all do. And during these times of division and strife, we must find a way to rediscover what is most important, one another.